So hello and welcome to this post on Viking archaeology, in which we will be talking about the Viking-age town of Trondheim in Norway. Now, towns are some of the places that fascinates me the most in Viking-age archaeology. They were new things in most parts of Northern Europe at this time, and few people lived in them, but they were places where lots of important things took place. Obviously, they connected trading networks, but they were also often places where big politics played out, where rulers came to put their foot down to gain control of a region or to fight it out with their opponents. And in addition, because early towns were so concentrated settlements, so much waste material accumulated there. Everything from the goldsmith's refuse to the kitchen garbage. And therefore they have an extraordinary archaeological record that can tell us a great many things, very rich and diverse. In most places where we would excavate something from the Viking Age, we'd be lucky to find a few dozen objects or structures that really tells us something. And compared to that, urban excavations are simply an explosion of information, and often information that we can order tightly in time to make for real history. The place we're going for this post is Trondheim in Western Norway. And the reason is this book, which came out just a few months ago. It's written in Norwegian, and parts of it is certainly written for people like citizens of Trondheim or people who knows the town very well. But beyond that, it's an extraordinary new synthesis of research of one of the key places in the Viking Age. The book is written by Axel Kristoffersen, who really is the author you'd wish to have for this book. He's an extraordinary person who seems to have lived 3 lives so far. Back in the 70s and 80s, he took part of some of the most extraordinary excavations in medieval towns in Scandinavia. And then in the 90s and 2000s, he was a very energetic museum director. And now he's one of the most active and inspiring scholars writing about Scandinavian archaeology and turning out great papers, and now this book. Apparently he also knew that this would be just a book for me, so he actually sent me this copy. So if you're watching, thank you very much, Axel, and congratulations with the great work. Trondheim, or Nidaros, that is what also known in the Middle Ages, is a really beautiful place. And I lived there for half a year as a student, and I've often visited since then. It has some great museums, and of course its famous cathedral, which was a famous destination for pilgrims in the Middle Ages. The Nidaros Dome was the northernmost cathedral in Scandinavia, and sort of a symbolic north to the Christian world. So devoted pilgrims would go to Rome in the south, and to Jerusalem in the east, and then to Santiago Compostela in the west in Spain, and to Trondheim in the north. And they would have visited sort of the 4 corners of the world, the Christian world. Trondheim is not one of the first generation of Viking Age towns, the emporia like Birka or Ribe that came into being in the 8th or early 9th century. Its history is a little bit later. It begins in the 10th century. And what is important is that Trondheim has some great excavations that have shown a great deal about how the town emerged. Back in the 1970s and 80s, big excavation projects were going on in several Norwegian towns, Bergen, Oslo, Stavanger, and all these have become landmarks in Scandinavian archaeology. But the Trondheim excavations were really some of the most important ones, especially the excavation at Folkebibliotekstomten, which lasted for a full 12 years, from 1973 to 1985. They excavated in some places up to 6 meters of stratigraphy, so layered sediments from the settlement that had been there throughout the Middle Ages. And they have some incredible preservation there. So you would find the wooden floors, the planked streets, corner timbered buildings, and all the leather objects and bone combs, whatever you'd find in a medieval and Viking Age settlement. They covered a very large area. I think they had 17 house plots excavated when they finished, and they could follow life in each of those plots generation from generation through the centuries. And in this way they got down to an incredibly rich record, not just of the medieval settlement, but also of the Viking Age settlement where all this began. And this can tell us a lot about how at least one town comes into being in the Viking Age, which I think is what is really fascinating about the case of Trondheim. Now, the medieval saga writers in the 13th century, they clearly had ideas about how this had happened. Trondheim was an important place in their world, and they wanted its history to fit with their worldviews. So we know the story of how the just king, the Christian king, Olaf Tryggvason, came to this place in 995 and ordered for a town and a church to be built there. And then pagans interfered and there was a big struggle, but then his successor, Olaf Haraldsson, who became Saint Olaf, completed the work and really made the town work there and last. And in this way, there was a story where the foundation of the town and of the cathedral there and Christianization in Norway went hand in hand, and in which the founder of the town was also the royal saint who was venerated in the church. So all that came together in a worldview. But all this, of course, is myth-making. Archaeology has worked out how things really happened, and this is the story which Axel Kristoffersen unveils in this book. Now, the story begins somewhere in the 800s. At that point, Trondheim fjord is a big settlement cluster in western Norway, and people have used the fjord to communicate. It's the easiest way to get about in this landscape, to use the fjord for sailing around. And at this time, of course, as we all know, enterprising Norwegian big farmers have started to organize both trading expeditions and raiding parties abroad on a big scale. The Viking Age has started. And Trondheim is in the middle of this landscape with its big farms, some of them famous from the sagas, like the Lade farm, where Earl Håkon lived in the 10th century, which is just next to Trondheim. And it's the town of Trondheim comes to be at the mouth of the biggest river in this landscape, the Nidaros River, so really at a nodal point in the landscape. It started to emerge at a narrow peninsula right at the middle, at the river mouth, so a very defined place cut off from the rest of the landscape. And in 1985, as the big excavations at Folkebibliotekstomten, they were coming to a close, the archaeologists discovered something extraordinary which nobody had known about for 1,000 years. It turned out that in this part in the middle of Trondheim, there had been a natural little bay at the river, a perfect natural harbor site. And this must be what some of the medieval sagas mention as the Skipakrok, so the bay of ships. And that was the natural point in the landscape where the original settlement had started to form. It was a shallow bay, and at the end of the Viking Age, it was no longer possible to sail in there. Everything had changed, but originally that had been the landscape feature which had allowed the settlement to thrive there. So what was the earliest activity there? Was it like a royal foundation with big buildings or so? No, not at all. So what starts out in Trondheim, the earliest activity that the archaeologists traced there, are just a few boathouses. And we can tell that they're built probably in the first half of the 10th century, so in the 900s. Or it could, for all we know, even be in the late 800s. So at some point it's what we'd call the mid-Viking Age. And clearly this was a place built for handling boats. It's boathouses. They're right on the beach there. But the other things that we would associate with a Viking Age trading place or early town are not really there. There's very little evidence of any trade, very little craft, apparently no permanent settlement. These things must have happened elsewhere. It was just a dedicated place for handling the boats. And Axel Christoffersen has this idea that it came to be as a sort of entrepot for the big farms of Trøndelag, where people from all these farms, which were all at that time engaged at some level with, well, the raiding that was going on in the British Isles or Western Europe, but also with the trading parties. They needed to organize and stage those parties, and that was where Skipakrok came in. It was just the natural place to assemble a fleet and to put it together for a big expedition. So little boats would gather there from all over the Trondheim fjord, and the big boats would sail out. Perhaps the people who first were active in this place were inspired by places like Dublin or Heatherby, and almost certainly some people had visited these places. But it was not a place like this. It was not a town. In a way, it was the opposite pole of the kind of network which created towns, the place where journeys were staged, where they started. The next step in that story starts in the mid-900s. It's probably in the 960s and 970s. The chronology is a little bit clear, but only a little bit. What happens then is that the bay, which at this time becomes impossible to navigate, is starting to be filled in deliberately with clay and sand, and people start building houses. And what Christoffersen argues is that means that they are now allowed to build houses. Obviously, this was land that belonged to somebody. You couldn't just land your boat there out of nowhere and just decide this is where I'll put my house. Somebody has to be asked. It's a very organized society. So whoever had previously organized the landing place with the boathouses apparently now allowed some people to settle there and make it their home. And the reason why we can say that they made it their home is that they invest enough. They invest in corner-timbered buildings, so nice, sturdy living quarters. You don't do that if you don't expect to be able to stay there. And now the things that we associate with a town in the Viking Age start to emerge. Now we see finds that give evidence of trade and connections to distant places, and we see lots of craftworking coming about. It's especially lots of metalworking debris that we found in this period. Obviously also a very diverse population settling there. So at this stage we might begin to talk about a Viking Age town coming into being. Axel Christoffersen again discusses how this came about. Why did it happen at that time? And he draws attention to what the Sagas describe as the Holaik earls, the earls who controlled the trade in northern Norway. A very important trade because they had access to very sought after commodities like walrus tusks, which is ivory, or eiderdown feathers and reindeer hides, reindeer horn, great fur products, and so on. The Holaik earls organized that trade, and the story, actually, the sagas have it that these earls moved south to live in Trondheim, or in the Trondheim region, at just about this time. So it's a very interesting coincidence that that's when the archaeologists found that somebody really organizes the trading settlement, or allows it to be organized by the presumably craftspeople and merchants who settle there. The third major change happens in this area just after the year 1000, and the key evidence for that actually was found quite recently. It was found in an excavation in 2016 and 17, when near to the early excavations was found the remains of an early church at the bayside. And it was clear that two of the building plots where there had been people settled in the late 10th century, they were leveled and filled in, and this big church was built on top of it. And there were some parts of the walls left. There was a wooden church, and you could see that some of the timbers used had been felled in the year 1008, 1009. That wasn't the year the church was built, however, because it was clear that this was reused timber. It had already marks from being used in another construction. So something had been pulled down, and this church had been constructed out of reused timber. So nobody had gone and cut down new timber for this church. Apparently people had been in a hurry. And again, this is a story which really fits very well with what the saga writers remembered from this time. Most of the sagas are written in the 13th or 12th century in some cases, but this was many generations previously. But there was a good oral history tradition. And what that oral history tradition tells us is that in the year 1015, the king Harald became Harald the Saint, first came to Trondheim to establish himself as a king. But now this had become so much of a center that this was the place in the region to do so. And he quickly established a major camp and a church which would fit the pattern of reused timber. King Olaf initially got chased out, but from this town onwards, we can see that the town really begins to grow steadily. It was still small by 1100, perhaps just 5 hectares at most, and a good estimate is that something like 1,500 people may have lived there. But it definitely was a medieval European town, the center of a big region in middle Norway, with churches, a cathedral, busy streets with craftspeople and merchants. The story about how this came to be can only be told today because of the dedicated efforts made over decades to explore the archaeology of the town. We can make that story fit with what transpires from the saga writings, but the saga writings in themselves could not have got the details right or shown which ones were significant and which ones had been embellished or made up. Now this story is told, and this is thanks to Axel's great book here. So I thank you for joining me on this voyage, and I hope that you'll be returning for more ventures into the world of Viking Age archaeology.